The Concord had held for 3,217 years. That number was not symbolic. It was not approximate. It was etched into the foundational charter of the Interstellar Concord in 7 different languages, including the oldest surviving dialect of the Vaethri, a species that had watched civilizations rise, plateau, and quietly collapse before humanity had learned to smelt iron. 3 millennia of enforced, negotiated, occasionally fragile, but ultimately unbroken peace between 41 recognized spacefaring civilizations. Then, on a Tuesday in March, it ended. The signal came through the Concord's standard diplomatic relay, the same channel used for trade disputes, territorial calibrations, and the occasional formal protest about mining rights near contested asteroid belts. Nothing about its arrival suggested urgency. The relay station at Proxima Junction logged it at 0347 Universal Coordinated Time. It passed through 3 automated filter systems. It was flagged, sorted, and queued for standard diplomatic review. It was not reviewed by a diplomat. It was reviewed by Lieutenant Commander Yara Singh of the United Earth Defense Secretariat, who was working a night rotation because her colleague had taken emergency leave. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time very slowly, with the kind of deliberate focus people use when they are certain they have misunderstood something important. She had not misunderstood. She picked up her communicator and called Director Emeka Osei at home. "Sir," she said. "The Vaethri have formally withdrawn from the Concorde." Pause. The sound of someone sitting up in bed. "They've done what?" "Withdrawn. Full Article 7 declaration. They've cited Concord Clause 19, unresolvable territorial grievance with a member civilization." She paused. "The grievance is filed against Earth." Another silence. Longer this time. "Get me the full text," Osei said quietly. "And get me Ambassador Chin. Now." The full text took 40 minutes to translate properly, not because the language was complex. The Vaethri had been communicating with human diplomats for over 2 centuries, but because the legal structure of their declaration required careful parsing. A mistranslation at this stage would be catastrophic. Words like territorial infringement carried very different weight than contested occupation, and the difference between a formal grievance and a declaration of hostile intent under Concord law was a matter of precise vocabulary. When the translation was confirmed, it did not improve the situation. The Vaethri were not filing a dispute. They were not requesting arbitration. They had withdrawn from the one legal framework that prevented any signatory from taking unilateral military action against another. And they had done so citing humanity specifically, citing the expansion of human colonies into what the Vaethri considered the Outer Reach Buffer Zone, a region of space that Earth's Territorial Survey Commission had classified 3 decades ago as unclaimed. The survey had been conducted with good faith. The maps had been submitted through proper Concord channels. No objection had been raised at the time. That, it turned out, was because the Vaethri had not been paying attention. They had been managing an internal succession crisis that lasted 11 years by human reckoning. When they emerged from it, they found 47 human colony stations operating inside what they considered sovereign boundary space. 3 decades of quiet resentment had apparently reached a threshold. Ambassador Chin Li arrived at the Secretariat building at 0512 in the morning. She was 63 years old, had served in diplomatic posts on 6 different space stations, and had spent 9 years negotiating the Proxima Resource Accords, the most complex multi-species trade agreement in human history. She was not a person who panicked. She read the declaration. She set it down. "How long do we have before this becomes public?" she asked. "The Vaethri transmitted through standard relay," Singh told her. "Other Concord members will receive it within 6 hours. The press will have it within 12, probably less." And their fleet position? This was the question that mattered. A formal withdrawal from the Concord removed the legal prohibition on military action, but it did not automatically constitute a declaration of war. The gap between those two things was real, and it was the only space humanity had to work with. The intelligence assessment was placed before Chin. She studied the fleet disposition maps without speaking for nearly 2 minutes. The Vaethri had not moved offensively. Not yet. But they had repositioned. 3 carrier groups that had been dispersed across their home system were now consolidated near the Reach border. It was a posture. A statement. A very large, very expensive, very serious statement. "They're not attacking," Chin said. "They're waiting." "Waiting for what?" Osei asked. "For us to understand that they could." She folded her hands on the table. "This is negotiation. Aggressive negotiation, but negotiation. They want the colonies removed or they want recognition of their boundary claims, or they want something that they believe we have refused to give them. She paused. The question is why they chose to do it this way rather than through Concord arbitration. The answer to that question would take another 18 hours to surface. When it did, it reframed everything. The Vaethri had attempted Concord arbitration 4 times over the course of 9 years. Each request had been logged, processed, and quietly deprioritized by the Concord's administrative apparatus. An apparatus that, by structural accident rather than conspiracy, was disproportionately staffed by species with close economic ties to human colonial expansion. The arbitration requests had not been rejected. They had been delayed, reviewed, sent to subcommittees, and delayed again. For 9 years, the Vaethri had watched their formal legal complaints disappear into bureaucratic silence while human colony infrastructure continued to expand. When Director Osei received this information, he sat with it for a long time. They weren't ignored on purpose, he said. No, Chin agreed. But they were ignored. And they've been watching those colonies grow for 3 decades. Yes. He stood and walked to the window. Outside, the city was beginning to light up with the ordinary rhythms of morning. People going to work. Children going to school. A civilization of 12 billion people distributed across a home world, 24 colonies, and 3 deep space habitats. None of whom knew yet that the oldest peace treaty in recorded interstellar history had just collapsed. What's their fleet capacity? He asked. The defense briefing summary was precise. The Vaethri could project approximately 340 combat-capable vessels into the contested region within 60 days. Their technology was not superior to humanity's current defense systems, but it was not inferior either. A conflict, if it came, would not be brief. It would not be clean. It would be the kind of war that left scars on civilizations for generations. We're not going to fight them, Osei said. It was not a question. No, Chin said. We're going to do something harder. She picked up the declaration again and read the final paragraph, the one that had been translated last, the one that the junior staff had almost missed because it was written in the old formal Vaethri script rather than the standard diplomatic register. It was a request. Buried under the withdrawal, under the repositioned fleets, under 3 decades of accumulated grievance. A request for a direct meeting. Not through the Concord. Not through intermediaries. With humanity's leadership. Directly. In 30 days. They left us a door, Chin said quietly. Osei looked at her. They also left 3 carrier groups near our border. Yes, she said, and something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but the composed, deliberate stillness of someone who has just identified the shape of a problem they have solved before. That's how you knock when you've been ignored for 9 years. 30 days is not a long time to prevent a war. It is, however, long enough to make critical mistakes. And the first decision made by the United Earth Defense Secretariat was to make as few decisions as possible until the full picture was understood. This restraint was not passivity. It was, as Ambassador Chen would later describe it in her published memoirs, the hardest discipline in diplomacy, the refusal to act before you know what you are acting upon. The 30-day window was divided, formally, into 3 phases. The first 10 days were dedicated entirely to intelligence. Not surveillance, not strategic positioning, but genuine comprehension of the Vaethri perspective. Earth's diplomatic corps contacted every academic institution, every xenocultural research department, every retired ambassador who had spent meaningful time with Vaethri counterparts. They were not looking for leverage. They were looking for understanding. What they found was uncomfortable. Dr. Miriam Okafor had spent 22 years studying Vaethri's social and political structure at the University of New Nairobi's Institute for Interstellar Anthropology. She was not a famous academic. She had not published best-selling popular science books or appeared on documentary feeds. She had written careful, densely sourced papers about Vaethri territorial philosophy that had been read by perhaps 3,000 people in her entire career. Within 48 hours of the declaration becoming public, she was on a secure call with Ambassador Chen. You have to understand something fundamental about the way they think about space, Okafor said. She pulled up a holographic diagram, a map of the contested region, but layered with cultural and historical data that standard territorial survey maps simply did not carry. For the Vaethri, territory is not ownership. It's not resources. It's memory. Explain that, Chen said. Their word for a region of sovereign space translates most accurately as the space where our dead traveled. Their colony ships, going back over 4,000 years, passed through the outer reach on their way to their current home systems. That route is not just historical, it's spiritually significant. The equivalent, in human terms, would be if a foreign civilization built 47 permanent settlements on the grounds of every major religious site your civilization had ever produced. A silence settled over the call. That's not in any of the standard briefing materials, Chen said. No, Okafor said simply. It's in my paper from 2281. It had a small readership. This was the moment, catalogued later, studied in diplomatic training programs across Earth, when the nature of the crisis fully clarified. The Varathari were not making a strategic land grab. They were not testing humanity's military response thresholds. They were expressing, in the only language that their political structure allowed for unresolvable grievances, something closer to profound cultural injury. The colonies were not just an inconvenience. They were, to Varathari understanding, a desecration. Director Osei convened an emergency session of the Earth Unified Council on Day 4. The session was not broadcast publicly, a decision that drew criticism from transparency advocates and was later defended on grounds that premature public exposure of the full scope of the crisis would have destabilized the diplomatic environment before it could be shaped. The council chambers were not particularly dramatic. They looked, as council chambers tend to, like an expensive corporate meeting room with better acoustics. 14 representatives from Earth's regional governance coalitions sat around a curved table, with Director Osei at the center and Ambassador Chen appearing via secure remote link from the Proxima Junction diplomatic station, where she had already relocated to reduce transit time for the eventual meeting. Osei laid out the situation without embellishment. We built on sacred ground, he said. Not intentionally. Not maliciously. Our survey teams followed correct procedure, the Concord administrative system failed to process their objections, and now we have a species with a 3-carrier group fleet positioned near our outer colonies who feel, with some justification, that we have spent 30 years ignoring them. He let that sit for a moment. The question before this council is not whether we can win a war with the Varathari. The question is whether we are the kind of civilization that should have been in this position in the first place, and what that answer requires of us now. Councillor Reyes from the South American Federation spoke first. What are the colony relocation logistics? Osei nodded to the infrastructure secretary, who pulled up the assessment. 47 stations. Combined population of approximately 340,000 people. Estimated relocation timeline, 18 months minimum for a safe, structured withdrawal. They want a meeting in 30 days, Reyes said. We can't relocate 47 stations in 30 days. No, Chen's voice came through the link, clear and steady. But we can offer to. That's not the same thing, and the Varathari understand the difference. The second phase of the 30 days, days 11 through 20, was dedicated to something the Defense Secretariat's internal documents called calibrated transparency. This was not spin. It was a deliberate strategy based on a specific reading of Varathari political culture. The Varathari operated under a governance structure that placed enormous weight on what might be translated as witnessed acknowledgement, the public, formal recognition of a wrong, made in a context where both parties understood that the acknowledgement was sincere. Their legal tradition had no real equivalent of adversarial proceedings. Their conflict resolution framework was built on the idea that most disputes were the result of incomplete information, and that once both parties genuinely understood the other's position, resolution became possible. This did not mean they were naive. It did not mean they were pacifists. Their fleet history included 2 major military campaigns in their recorded past, both of which had been prosecuted with considerable effectiveness. But it meant that what they were waiting for, at the most fundamental level, was not a concession. It was recognition. Earth's diplomatic team drafted a formal communication, not a legal document, not a treaty proposal, not a strategic offer. A letter. Written in standard diplomatic Varathari, reviewed by Okafor and 2 other xenocultural specialists, structured according to the Varathari tradition of first address correspondence. A form reserved for communications between parties who were acknowledging each other's full standing for the first time. It said, in precise and careful language, that Earth had not known what the outer reach meant to the Varathari people. It said that Earth had benefited from a Concord administrative failure that had silenced legitimate grievances for nearly a decade. It said that Earth was prepared to discuss, in good faith and without preconditions, what acknowledgement of those grievances should look like. It did not promise to remove the colonies. It did not offer a timetable. It did not outline a negotiating position. It said, essentially, we understand now that we did not understand before. We are listening. The response from the Varathari came in 11 hours, far faster than their standard diplomatic communication cycle. The meeting would proceed. On day 21, the Defense Secretariat released its full strategic assessment to the Council. Not the sanitized summary, the complete document, including the scenarios that made for uncomfortable reading. If negotiations failed and military action followed, Earth's defense networks could absorb an initial Viatari strike with acceptable losses. Acceptable being a word that the assessment's authors had clearly struggled with, given that it encompassed potential casualties in the tens of thousands and worst-case projections. A sustained campaign would be different. The Viatari had strategic depth, supply chain resilience, and, critically, the moral high ground in Concord public opinion. Most of the other 39 Concord civilizations had received the withdrawal declaration with alarm rather than condemnation. Several had quietly signaled sympathy with the Viatari position. A protracted human-Viatari conflict would not be a bilateral problem. It would reshape every alliance structure humanity had built over 2 centuries of interstellar diplomacy. "We don't fight," said Counselor Adeyemi of the West African Compact. "Not as a question. We don't fight," Osei confirmed. "Not because we couldn't. Because we shouldn't. And because the Viatari, for all of this, have not actually attacked anyone. They've repositioned a fleet and filed a withdrawal declaration. That's not an act of war, it's a very loud request for a conversation." The Council voted. 12 in favor of proceeding to direct negotiation. 1 abstention. 1 vote for a parallel military readiness escalation, which was noted and filed and did not change the primary directive. Ambassador Chen would lead the delegation. She departed for the meeting site, a neutral deep space station called the Meridian Platform, jointly administered by 3 non-involved Concord species, on day 23. She brought 7 advisors, 3 cultural specialists, 1 defense attaché who was there for protocol and kept very quiet, and a handwritten personal note from Director Osei that she did not share with anyone. On the journey she reread Okafor's paper 3 times. When she arrived at Meridian Platform and was shown to the receiving hall where the Viatari delegation was already waiting, she did not come in with a prepared opening statement. She came in with a question. The Meridian Platform was not designed for beauty. It was a functional deep space administrative station, angular, pressurized, built by the Kelhari Compact in the early 22nd century as a neutral processing hub for interspecies commercial disputes. Its corridors were wide enough to accommodate 4 different body plans, its atmosphere was a carefully engineered compromise that no species found ideal and none found dangerous, and its lighting cycled through a spectrum that attempted, with partial success, to serve the visual range of 6 different biological configurations. It smelled faintly of recycled air and machine lubricant. The meeting table was a slab of composite material that had been argued over for 3 weeks because the Viatari sat lower than humans and the Kelhari sat higher, and the geometry of mutual eye contact across a negotiating table carries political weight that non-diplomatic observers consistently underestimate. Ambassador Chen had been to uglier rooms. She had also been to more comfortable ones. Neither category mattered. What mattered was the delegation on the other side of the table. The Viatari envoy was called Ethan Vraz, a name that in its original form carried honorific suffixes indicating senior diplomatic rank and what translated roughly as speaking authority, meaning the power to commit without further consultation. Vraz was not young by Viatari standards. His bioluminescent skin markings, which shifted with emotional state in ways that Dr. Okafor had briefed the delegation on extensively, were muted and still, the pattern associated with formal restraint. He had brought 5 advisors and 2 members of what the Viatari called the record keeper class, individuals whose role was to witness and document, and whose presence at a negotiation indicated that the Viatari considered this meeting to be historically significant. That was either a good sign or a very serious one. Possibly both. Chen entered the room first, ahead of her delegation, which was itself a calculated choice. The Viatari tradition of first address placed significance on the order of entry, and entering first indicated a willingness to be in the room before the other party was ready to receive you. It was a gesture of trust, or at least of stated trust, which in diplomacy functions similarly. Vraz watched her enter. His markings shifted briefly, a pattern Okafor had described as recognition of unexpected gesture, and then stilled again. Chen sat. She did not open with prepared remarks. She did not present a document. She asked her question. How do your people speak of the outer reach? Not in the legal documents, in the way a parent would describe it to a child. The silence that followed lasted approximately 7 seconds, which in the context of a high-stakes diplomatic opening was an extraordinarily long silence. Vraz looked at her. His markings shifted through 2 colors she hadn't been briefed on specifically, something in the amber and deep violet register, before settling into a new configuration. He answered. What he said, translated carefully by the team's senior interpreter with Okafor reviewing in real time through an earpiece, was something like this. The reach is where our first voices traveled. When our ancestors left the world that made them and moved into the dark between stars, they passed through that space and they sang. We do not know if the songs were heard. But we do not build over the places where songs were sung. There was nothing strategic in the question or the answer. There was no legal framework being established, no negotiating position being staked. It was two people in an ugly room on a neutral space station, 3,000 years of established peace hanging by threads, acknowledging that something real had happened. Chin nodded slowly. We didn't know, she said. That is a failure I can explain, but I won't use the explanation as an excuse. Vraz's markings shifted again. The interpreter, listening to Okafor simultaneously, passed a quiet note to Chen's assistant. The color pattern he's showing has no standard diplomatic translation. Dr. Okafor says it's something closer to personal than formal, something like being heard for the first time. The first 2 days were not negotiation in any conventional sense. They were, by mutual and unspoken agreement, a process of account giving. The Varathari delegation presented their 9 years of arbitration requests, not as a legal argument but as a narrative. Each request read aloud, the date filed, the date it disappeared into committee review, the date they stopped expecting a response. The record keepers documented everything in the flowing pictographic script of formal Varathari history. Chen's delegation did not interrupt. They did not contest the timeline. They had verified it independently and found it accurate. When the account was complete, Chen presented Earth's corresponding record, not a defense, but a structural analysis of how the Concord arbitration system had failed. The administrative bottlenecks, the understaffing, the economic incentives that had, without any coordinating conspiracy, consistently deprioritized the grievances of species with fewer trade connections to humanity's colonial expansion. We are not absolved by the absence of intent, Chen said. We are only trying to demonstrate that fixing this requires structural change, not just bilateral agreement. Vraz conferred briefly with his advisors. You propose to reform the Concord process. We propose to advocate for it, yes. We cannot guarantee the outcome of a reform process that involves 41 civilizations. We can guarantee our position in that process, and we can provide documentation of our commitment that your record keepers can hold. The idea of Earth voluntarily creating an accountable, witness-verified commitment that could be used against them in future Concord proceedings was not a small thing. Vraz understood what it meant. His delegation understood what it meant. It meant humanity was accepting exposure. The kind of exposure that could only come from genuine intent to follow through. Day 3 was harder. The colonies were the core of it. Not the abstract territorial principle, but the specific human reality of 340,000 people who had built lives in the outer reach, who had grown up there, who had buried relatives there, who ran businesses and raised families and had no individual connection to the diplomatic failure that had placed them in this position. Chen did not pretend this was simple. I can offer you a phased withdrawal timeline, she said. 18 months for a safe, structured relocation. We cannot do it faster without endangering the residents. We will not do it faster. The space should not have been settled, Vraz said. His markings were steady now, the formal restraint fully back in place. The injury has compounded for 30 years. Yes, Chen said. And undoing 30 years in 30 days would create new injuries to replace the old ones. I don't believe that's what you want. I believe you want acknowledgement that what happened was wrong and a credible commitment that it will be corrected. Acknowledgement without timeline is nothing. Then let's agree on a timeline that doesn't require us to endanger 340,000 people in the process. The negotiation that followed was specific, technical, and exhausting. A preliminary agreement framework was drafted over 72 hours of continuous sessions, with both delegations working in 6-hour rotations to maintain cognitive function. The framework covered 5 key areas: a phased colonial relocation schedule with hard deadlines and accountability measures, a formal Earth acknowledgement of Varathari territorial claims in the outer reach to be submitted to the full Concord, a joint petition for Concord arbitration reform with Earth as primary signatory, a cultural preservation commission with Varathari oversight to document the reach's historical significance, and a bilateral communication channel that bypassed the standard Concord administrative structure. It was not a perfect agreement. No agreement of that scope and stakes is ever perfect. There were provisions that Chen's defense attaché quietly flagged as strategically uncomfortable. There were timelines that the Infrastructure Secretariat would later describe as aggressively optimistic. There were clauses that required interpretation and would be argued over for years afterward. But when Vraz and Chin signed the preliminary framework, in 7 languages with the record keepers present and formally witnessing, both delegations knew something that would take the rest of the Concord slightly longer to absorb. The war that had seemed 10 days earlier, like a serious and plausible outcome, had been navigated around. Not by strength. Not by deterrence. By a question about how a parent would describe something to a child. What the wider Concord observed, watching the Meridian platform proceedings through official channels, was subtler than the headlines would later suggest. They did not see humanity capitulate. They did not see the Viathri back down. They saw a species that had been wronged receive genuine acknowledgement, and a species that had caused the wrong accept accountability without collapsing into either defensiveness or performance. Several Concord observers filed private assessments with their home governments in the days that followed. One of those assessments, later leaked and widely circulated, contained a line that diplomatic historians would quote for decades. "We expected either defiance or appeasement. We received neither." What humanity demonstrated at Meridian was the rare and dangerous capability of a civilization that understands the difference between being right and being correct, and chooses correctness. The Varathari fleet returned to dispersed positions on the 41st day. 3 carrier groups quietly standing down. Not announced. Not celebrated. Simply no longer a threat. Director Osei received the confirmation at 0223 in the morning. He sat with it for a while. Then he called Chin, who was still at Meridian platform finishing the formal documentation. "It's done," he said. "It started," she replied. Neither of them were wrong. The 41 civilizations of the interstellar Concord were, in practical terms, not a unified body. They were a framework, a complex, layered, perpetually negotiated architecture of mutual agreements, shared institutions, and carefully maintained balances of interest that had accumulated over 3,000 years of interstellar contact. No 2 Concord species had identical values. No 2 had identical strategic priorities. What they shared was an investment in the framework itself, the recognition that the alternative to an imperfect multilateral system was a collection of bilateral arrangements that historically tended to escalate. The Concord had survived 3 serious near collapses in its history. Each time, the instinct to preserve the framework had ultimately outweighed the grievances threatening to break it. The Viathri withdrawal had been the most serious rupture in over 400 years. What happened at Meridian platform was therefore watched, carefully, analytically, with the full attention of 39 separate foreign ministries, not as a bilateral human Viathri affair, but as a data point about what the Concord was and what it could survive. The Kelhari Compact was the first non-involved civilization to formally respond. The Kelhari were, by any reasonable assessment, the Concord's most experienced diplomatic operators. Their civilization had been spacefaring for over 8,000 years. They had participated in the original founding negotiations. Their current senior arbiter, a figure whose name translated approximately as first voice in long deliberation, had spent over 3 centuries in active diplomatic service, which was not unusual for a species with a natural lifespan of roughly 400 years. The Kelhari assessment, distributed to all Concord member governments within 72 hours of the Meridian signing, was measured in its language and precise in its conclusions. It noted that Earth had made several significant concessions: the colonial withdrawal timeline, the formal acknowledgement of Viathri territorial claims, the advocacy for Concord reform. These were not trivial commitments. They would cost Earth politically and economically. It also noted what Earth had not done. Earth had not escalated militarily when the Viathri repositioned their fleet. Earth had not invoked the mutual defense clauses that its treaty partners in the Cygnus coalition might have been obligated to honor. Earth had not attempted to leverage its economic relationships to pressure the Viathri. Earth had not run a media campaign framing the crisis as Viathri aggression. The restraint was as significant as the concession, the Kelhari assessment concluded. A civilization under perceived military pressure that chooses to absorb short-term vulnerability in pursuit of long-term structural resolution is demonstrating a form of strategic maturity that the Concord's current challenges require. The document circulated widely. It was discussed in 37 foreign ministries within a week. Not all reactions were favorable. The Dresh hegemony, a mid-tier Concord civilization that had historically maintained competitive rather than cooperative relations with Earth, distributed its own assessment, which reached rather different conclusions. The Dresh position was that the Meridian Agreement represented a dangerous precedent. If a civilization could withdraw from the Concord, reposition military assets near a rival's territory, and receive substantive concessions in return, then the framework's deterrent function had been weakened. Future grievances would be prosecuted through military posturing rather than arbitration, because military posturing had now been demonstrated to work. This was not an unreasonable analysis. It was, in fact, the analysis that kept several people in Earth's Defense Secretariat awake at night. Ambassador Chen addressed it directly in her post-Meridian report to the Unified Council. "The Dresch concern is legitimate," she wrote. "It is also, I would argue, precisely why we pushed so hard for Concord arbitration reform as a core element of the agreement. The Viathri didn't bypass arbitration because military posturing is more effective. They bypassed it because the arbitration system failed them repeatedly. If we fix the system, we remove the incentive for future grievance to escalate." She paused at this point in the document and added a line that was more personal than policy. "The Dresch are not wrong that the precedent exists. What matters is whether we treat it as a precedent for escalation or a precedent for reform. That choice is ours." The most unexpected response came from the Sauri Collective. The Sauri were, by Concord standards, a relatively young spacefaring civilization. They had achieved interstellar capacity approximately 200 years ago and had spent most of that time carefully and quietly learning the Concord structures before engaging heavily with its politics. Their internal culture placed high value on observational patience. They were known for taking years to respond to diplomatic communications that other species would answer in days. They responded to Meridian in 9 hours. Their message was brief even by their standards. It expressed support for the framework agreement and, notably, a formal request to join Earth's proposed coalition for Concord arbitration reform. Director Osei was reading the morning intelligence summary when he came across the Sauri communication. He read it twice. "They never do anything in 9 hours, said his senior Concord analyst, Dr. Priya Mehta, when Osei brought it to her attention. They did this time. Something about Meridian resonated with them specifically. She pulled up the Sauri's diplomatic history, a long, careful record of watching other civilizations make decisions. They've been filing low-level grievances through Concord arbitration for 60 years, she said. Standard stuff, boundary clarifications, resource access disputes. Most of them are still in committee review. Osei looked at her. How many civilizations, he said slowly, have pending arbitration requests that have been sitting in committee for years? Mehta ran the query. The answer came back in seconds. 26. 26 of the Concord's 41-member civilizations had active arbitration requests that had been in administrative review for more than 3 years. Several had requests dating back over a decade. The Viathri situation was not unique. It was representative. The Concord's arbitration system had been quietly failing for years, and the only reason it hadn't produced more crises was that most civilizations lacked either the military capacity or the accumulated grievance to escalate the way the Viathri had. This finding landed in the Defense Secretariat like a slow detonation. The full scope of what Mehta's query had revealed became the operational priority for the next 6 months. It reframed everything. The crisis with the Viathri was not an anomaly. It was a symptom. The Concord's foundational mechanism for resolving disputes without military escalation had degraded, slowly, structurally, without malicious intent, into a system that processed grievances selectively and buried the ones that didn't have sufficiently powerful advocates. Earth's experience as a colonial expansion power meant that it had, without realizing it, contributed significantly to this dynamic. The Concord's administrative apparatus had been oriented, subtly and systemically, toward the interests of established, economically connected civilizations. Species without strong trade ties to the major powers found their cases deprioritized not through conspiracy but through the simple mechanics of institutional incentive. Director Osei presented this analysis to the Unified Council on the 52nd day after the Meridian signing. "We are not the villain of this story," he said. "We are also not the hero. We are a civilization that built significant power and influence without fully understanding the structural effects of that power on the framework everyone depends on. Meridian gave us the chance to start correcting that. The question before this council is how seriously we intend to pursue it." The answer, debated over 3 sessions, was more ambitious than many council members had anticipated. Earth would not simply advocate for arbitration reform. It would fund it. A substantial portion of Earth's annual Concord contributions, a figure that represented real economic sacrifice, would be redirected toward expanding and restructuring the arbitration system. Earth would also open its diplomatic facilities at Proxima Junction to serve as an overflow processing center for backlogged cases. The announcement was made jointly with the Viathri, who had agreed to formally re-engage with the Concord, Not an immediate full reaccession, which would have required lengthy process, but a formal statement of intent to return, contingent on demonstrated progress in the reform process. The effect on Concord public opinion was substantial. 23 member civilizations issued statements of support within 2 weeks. The Sauri Collective sent a second message, also unusually brief, also unusually fast, that consisted entirely of a traditional Sauri phrase that translated as "the long observation is complete." Even the Dresch hegemony, which maintained its structural concerns about the precedent, conceded in a formal assessment that Earth's post-meridian conduct had been consistent with the stated intent of a civilization seeking systemic correction rather than strategic advantage. That was, from the Dresch, practically an endorsement. What the Concord had witnessed across 52 days was the following sequence. A major treaty rupture triggered by legitimate, long-suppressed grievance. A near-military crisis resolved through direct negotiation. A bilateral framework that addressed both the specific injury and its systemic cause. And then a sustained, economically costly multilateral effort to fix the underlying problem. No species in the Concord's history had managed all 4 stages without at least one failure, usually at the 3rd or 4th stage when the political cost of following through began to exceed the political benefit. Earth had not failed. Not yet. That was the part that surprised everyone. The preliminary framework signed at Meridian Platform was 14 pages long and contained, in its appendices, a relocation schedule that the Infrastructure Secretariat privately described as technically feasible under optimal conditions, which is the institutional language for "this will be extremely difficult and something will go wrong." 47 colonial stations. Combined population of 340,000 people. 18 months. The diplomatic achievement was real. The human cost of implementing it was equally real. And unlike the negotiating table, where the variables were strategic and the damage was abstract, the relocation was a problem that existed in the lives of specific people, in specific places, who had received a specific notification that their homes were being decommissioned. The notification protocol had been debated extensively before being finalized. There were advocates for a soft approach, phased announcements, voluntary early relocation incentives, community consultation processes that extended the timeline for consensus building. There were advocates for a hard approach, clear, legally unambiguous notification of mandatory relocation on a fixed schedule, with full government support but no negotiation on the fundamental decision. What was ultimately implemented was neither, and both. Every resident of every outer reach colony received a personal notification on the same day, not a mass broadcast but a direct communication addressed to them by name, explaining what had happened, why the relocation was happening, and what support was being provided. The notification included a contact path to a dedicated relocation support office, staffed by real human beings rather than automated systems. Director Osei had insisted on this. The people in the outer reach had not caused the diplomatic failure. They had not been consulted about the colonial expansion decisions made decades before many of them were born. They deserved to be spoken to as individuals, not managed as a demographic. The notifications were sent on day 61. Kovac Station, Outer Reach Sector 7, had a population of approximately 4,200 people and had been continuously inhabited for 23 years. Station Director Hannah Kowalczyk received her notification at 0814 local time. She read it in her office with the door closed. Then she went to the General Assembly Hall and gathered her community. She was not a practiced public speaker. She did not have a communications team. She had run Kovac Station for 11 years and knew most of its residents by name. She read them the notification. She answered questions for 3 hours. Then she told them what she had already communicated to the Infrastructure Secretariat. Kovac Station would comply with the relocation schedule. They would take the full 18 months. They would not leave anything behind that could be salvaged. And they had one request, that the formal decommissioning of the station include a ceremony of some kind, not for their sake, but as a signal to the Varathari that the people leaving understood the significance of the ground they were leaving. The Infrastructure Secretariat passed the request to Ambassador Chin. Chin passed it to Vraz, through the bilateral communication channel that now bypassed standard Concord administration. Vraz's response came back in 3 hours. The Varathari would send an observer to the ceremony. Not a diplomat. A record keeper. When Kowalczyk received this information, she sat with it for a long time. "They'll remember us," she said to her deputy, not in pride but in something closer to the weight of the word responsible. "We have to leave this right." Not all 340,000 residents of the outer reach responded with Kowalczyk's equanimity. This should not be surprising. It would have been deeply unusual if they had. The political backlash on Earth was significant. Several Unified Council members who had voted for the Meridian framework faced intense domestic pressure from constituencies that had family or economic connections to the Outer Reach colonies. The criticism ranged from legitimate, "Why were colonists not given more voice in the decision?" to bad faith, "Earth's leadership surrendered sovereign territory to alien threats," to the kind of generalized fear-driven anger that crisis always produces. Director Osei gave a public address on Day 64 that is studied, in retrospect, as a template for communicating difficult truths in the context of public anxiety. He did not minimize the difficulty. He did not invoke abstract principles of interstellar peace as a reason for residents to simply accept their circumstances. He acknowledged, directly, that the decision to relocate the colonies imposed real costs on real people who had done nothing wrong. "But here is what I want to be honest about," he said. "We have been in the Outer Reach for 30 years. We expanded there because our surveys showed it was unclaimed. Our surveys were correct about the legal status and wrong about the human status. There are places in this galaxy that carry meaning we didn't understand because we didn't ask. We're asking now. And the answer changes what we owe." He paused for a moment before continuing. "I'm not asking the people of the Outer Reach to be satisfied with this. I'm asking them to trust that the full weight of what they're giving up is being accounted for, not just in the relocation support package, which I want to be clear is being treated as an absolute priority, but in what we are building in exchange. A Concord that works. An arbitration system that doesn't fail the next species that has something important to say. A relationship with the Viathari that starts from honesty rather than convenience." The address received mixed reviews in the immediate aftermath. 6 months later, it was rated in public approval surveys as the most trusted major political speech of the year. The relocation itself, over the following 18 months, was neither clean nor seamless. 2 stations encountered serious technical complications that extended their schedules past the original framework timeline. This required formal renegotiation with the Viathari, a tense process conducted through the bilateral channel, with VRAS applying what Chin later described as principled flexibility, accepting the extended timeline while formally registering the delay in the record keeper's documentation. One station, Reach Station 14, saw a group of approximately 60 residents, out of a population of 1,800, refuse to relocate and establish a position of civil noncompliance. The situation was handled without any use of security force. It was resolved through a combination of extended direct negotiation with the non-compliant residents, and, crucially, through a communication facilitated by Chen and Vraz in which 3 of the non-compliant residents spoke directly with members of the Viathari Cultural Commission working on the Outer Reach Preservation Project. What those residents learned in that conversation changed most of their minds. The Viathari were not erasing the stations. They were incorporating them. The human presence in the Outer Reach over 30 years had left a record, physical, cultural, historical, that the Viathari intended to document and preserve as part of the Reach's layered history. The stations were not being treated as an offense to be expunged. They were being treated as an additional chapter in the story of a place that had been accumulating stories for thousands of years. 57 of the 60 non-compliant residents relocated within 3 weeks. The remaining 3 were ultimately assisted by family members who came to help them move. Station Kovacs held its decommissioning ceremony on the 419th day of the relocation process. Hannah Kowalczyk spoke briefly. She did not make grand political statements. She talked about specific things. The first year, when the hydroponic systems kept failing and the station lived on protein supplements and stubborn optimism. The year they got the observation deck working and could watch the Reach's particular quality of nebular light without a viewport obstruction. The names of the children who had been born on the station and would not remember it. The Viathari record keeper, a young individual by their reckoning perhaps 60 years old, stood at the edge of the ceremony in formal witness posture, their recording instrument active, their markings the quiet steady amber of deep attention. When the ceremony was complete and the station's operational systems began their decommissioning sequence, Kowalczyk approached the record keeper. "Will it be remembered?" she asked. Through the interpreter. The record keeper's response was formal and careful and, when translated, precise. "In our tradition, the places where lives were lived are never forgotten. They become part of the song. Your station will be in the record of this place." Kowalczyk nodded. She looked at the station around her, the corridors where she had walked for 11 years, the assembly hall where she had addressed her community on the day the notifications came, the observation deck, and then she walked to the transport that was waiting. She did not look back. The Concord Arbitration Reform Coalition formally convened for the first time on the 98th day after the Meridian signing, at a session hosted by Earth's diplomatic facilities at Proxima Junction. 21 member civilizations attended. Another 7 sent observer delegations. The Dresch hegemony sent a representative with no formal mandate, which was their standard method of monitoring proceedings. They had not yet decided whether to join. It was, by any honest assessment, a more fragile coalition than it looked from the outside. The civilizations present shared a single concrete grievance. Their arbitration cases had been deprioritized, but shared almost nothing else. Their strategic interests diverged substantially. Their relationships with Earth ranged from close partnership to historical suspicion. Several were attending primarily to observe whether Earth's stated commitment to reform was genuine or a sophisticated form of reputation management. Ambassador Chen was not present at the opening session. She was still managing the final stages of the Viathari framework implementation. Her deputy, senior diplomat Marcus Webb, led the Earth delegation. Webb was not Chen. He was thorough, methodical, and deeply competent in the structural mechanics of Concord law, and he had no particular talent for the kind of trust building that the coalition's fragility required. He knew this about himself. He compensated by preparing more rigorously than anyone else in the room. His opening statement took 11 minutes. It contained no rhetoric. It was a precise, documented account of the Concord arbitration system's structural failures, including specific cases from 11 member civilizations that had been provided with their permission, showing how their legitimate grievances had been administratively delayed. It named no villains. It described mechanisms. At the end of it, the representative from the Horith Principality, a small but respected civilization that had been trying to resolve a boundary dispute for 8 years, said in a flat tone that conveyed a great deal, "This is the first time I've heard our case described accurately in an official Concord proceeding." The session continued for 9 hours. What followed over the next 14 months was not the dramatic confrontation that popular accounts would later compress it into. It was slow, technical, frequently tedious, and punctuated by genuine crises that threatened to collapse the coalition several times. The first serious threat came from within the Concord's administrative apparatus itself. The existing arbitration system was not staffed by malicious actors. It was staffed by bureaucrats, experienced, in many cases talented, operating within institutional incentive structures that had quietly accumulated over centuries. When the Reform Coalition proposed a series of structural changes to case processing, timeline requirements, and resource allocation, the administrative response was not hostility. It was something more difficult: the dense, procedurally correct resistance of an institution defending its own operational continuity. Every proposed reform generated a counter-proposal. Every timeline was challenged on grounds of implementation feasibility. Every resource reallocation triggered concerns about the impact on existing operations. The process produced enormous quantities of documentation, most of which had to be reviewed by legal specialists from multiple civilizations before anyone could act on it. Webb described it, in a private communication to Chen, as fighting a bureaucratic glacier with a letter opener. Chen's response was characteristically direct: "Stop fighting it and build around it. The existing system can process what it processes. Build a parallel track for the backlogged cases and let the institutional resistance exhaust itself on the margins while you move the actual work forward." This was the strategic pivot that unstuck the process. The Provisional Rapid Arbitration Track, PRAT, an acronym that Webb noted was unfortunately appropriate, was established not as a replacement for the existing system but as an emergency overflow mechanism. Its legal basis was obscure but technically sound, a rarely invoked provision in the Concord's founding charter allowing for temporary special procedures in cases of demonstrated administrative backlog. The Kelhari Compact's legal team had identified the provision. Earth's team had confirmed its applicability. The Sauri Collective had provided 3 senior arbitrators with deep experience in precisely the categories of cases most affected. PRAT was operational within 4 months. In its first year, it cleared 41 backlogged cases, including several that had been waiting for over a decade. It did not resolve all of them favorably. Some parties did not receive the outcomes they had hoped for. But they received decisions, made by qualified arbitrators within published timelines, with documented reasoning. The effect on Concord credibility was disproportionate to the number of cases resolved. The framework's deterrent value, its ability to prevent military escalation by providing a credible alternative, depended on member civilizations believing the system could actually deliver results. For years that belief had been quietly eroding. 41 resolved cases in 1 year was not statistically transformative. But it was demonstrably real, and in an institution built on precedent, demonstrably real matters. The Dresch hegemony joined the Reform Coalition on the 304th day. They did not announce it dramatically. They sent a formal accession notification through standard diplomatic channels, accompanied by a technical memorandum outlining their proposed amendments to the PRAT procedural guidelines. The amendments were substantive and some of them were improvements. Webb, processing the notification, allowed himself a brief private moment before forwarding it to Chin. A response: told you. 300 days, not 400. You owe me a very good coffee when you're back. The Dresch accession changed the coalition's political weight significantly. The hegemony's concerns about the precedents set at Meridian had not disappeared, they remained on record, and they continued to inform Dresch participation in the coalition's deliberations. But they had concluded, through their extended observation period, that Earth's conduct was consistent with genuine systemic intent rather than strategic maneuvering. Or, as the Dresch formal accession document put it in language that was as close to a compliment as the hegemony typically produced, Earth's post-Meridian conduct has been characterized by a degree of consistency between stated principle and operational action that warrants constructive engagement. The Varathari formally re-acceded to the interstellar Concorde on the 472nd day. The ceremony was held at Meridian Platform, by mutual agreement, not because anyone was sentimental, but because the location had symbolic weight that both parties recognized was worth honoring. Envoy Vraz signed the re-accession document alongside Ambassador Chin, who had flown in from Proxima Junction specifically for the occasion. Vraz's markings during the signing were not the muted formal restraint of their first meeting. They were something that Okafor, watching through remote feed and consulting her 22 years of research, identified with quiet certainty as the pattern associated with a completed mourning, the state of having processed a grief fully enough that it no longer controls you, while not pretending it didn't happen. Chin recognized the shift. She had been briefed. She said nothing about it because nothing needed to be said. She signed. Vraz signed. The record keepers documented. Afterward, in the brief informal period that followed the official ceremony, Vraz said something to Chen that was not recorded in any official documentation. She included it in her memoirs published years later, with his permission. When you asked me in the first session how a parent describes the reach to a child, I had not expected that. We had prepared for legal arguments. We had prepared for strategic positions. We had not prepared for a question that required an honest answer. That was the point, Chin said. I know, Vraz said. It was also the moment I began to believe this was possible. The final report of the Concorde Arbitration Reform Commission was submitted to the full membership on the 631st day after the Meridian signing. It was 847 pages long. It proposed restructuring the administrative apparatus of the arbitration system, establishing mandatory timeline requirements with enforceable consequences, creating a structural review mechanism to assess and correct systemic bias in case prioritization, and making the PRAT permanent rather than provisional. It passed the full Concorde vote by a margin of 37 in favor, 2 opposed and 2 abstentions. The 2 opposed were civilizations whose heavy involvement in the Concorde's administrative apparatus meant they stood to lose the most from its restructuring. Their opposition was noted, documented, and ultimately insufficient. The 2 abstentions were recorded without comment. 37 in favor, in a body of 41, for a reform of the foundational mechanism that held interstellar peace together. Director Osei received the vote confirmation at 11:47 in the morning. He was in a routine budget review meeting with his department heads. He excused himself, stepped into the corridor and read the confirmation twice. Then he went back into the meeting and finished the budget review. When his assistant asked him afterward why he hadn't made more of the moment, he said something that circulated widely once the memoirs and histories were written. The vote passing is the beginning of the work, he said. We celebrate when the work is done. We haven't gotten there yet. He was correct. The implementation of the reform would take years. There would be setbacks. There would be institutional resistance that outlasted initial momentum. There would be cases that still fell through the cracks, and grievances that still accumulated longer than they should. But the architecture had changed. 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days after Lieutenant Commander Yara Singh read the Varathari withdrawal declaration at 0347 in the morning, she was promoted to commander and assigned to a new position. Deputy Director of the Concorde Liaison Office at Proxima Junction. She had not sought the promotion. She had been recommended for it by Director Osei, who noted in his recommendation that she was the first human being to have read the document that nearly ended 3,000 years of peace, and had responded by doing precisely the right thing, which was to call someone who could do something about it. This was not a small observation. In the months and years that followed the Meridian crisis, a significant amount of analysis had been dedicated to the question of failure modes, the points at which the situation could have gone differently, in ways that would have been catastrophic. The list was longer than comfortable. If Singh had delayed the call. If Osei had escalated militarily before Chen had time to establish the diplomatic framework. If Chen had opened with a legal argument instead of a question. If the Varathari had interpreted Earth's initial communication as confirmation of bad faith. If the Concord's administrative apparatus had successfully delayed the arbitration reform coalition long enough for political momentum to collapse. If the colony relocation had been handled with less care, producing public backlash sufficient to destabilize the framework. Any one of these failure points, had it gone the other way, could have produced a different outcome. Some could have produced war. The peace that held was not inevitable. It was a sequence of decisions, each made by specific people under specific pressures, each of which could have gone another way. This is the part that popular narratives about the Meridian Resolution tend to underweight. The resolution became, inevitably, because this is what historical memory does, a story about institutional wisdom and civilizational maturity. A story about humanity at its best. And there is truth in that framing. The decisions made during the crisis were, on balance, good ones, made by people who were trying to get them right. But wisdom and maturity are not the same thing as certainty. The people making those decisions were not confident they were right. They were making the best choices they could identify under genuine uncertainty, with incomplete information, under time pressure, in an environment where the cost of error was catastrophic. Chin, in her memoirs, was explicit about this. I did not know that asking Vraz about the Reach's cultural meaning would open the negotiation, she wrote. I thought it might. I had been briefed carefully by Dr. Okafor, and I trusted Okafor's work, and I believed, believed, that the Varathari would respond to genuine curiosity rather than strategic positioning. I was right. I could have been wrong. The distance between those two outcomes was not strategic brilliance. It was a well-prepared guess made by a person who had done her homework and gotten lucky in the ways that matter. This honest assessment was sometimes read as false modesty. It was not. It was the kind of accurate self-appraisal that experienced diplomats develop when they have seen enough near misses to stop attributing success entirely to skill. What did change permanently after Meridian, and this is the part that mattered, was the structural landscape. The reformed Concord arbitration system processed 847 cases in its first 3 years of full operation. The backlog that had accumulated over decades was cleared within 2 years. New cases were processed within published timelines, with a compliance rate that exceeded projections by a margin the Administrative Commission publicly attributed to cultural shift within the apparatus. The institutional equivalent of an organization that has been embarrassed publicly and is now working hard to not repeat the experience. 12 civilizations that had had pending grievances for years received decisions. Not all of those decisions went in their favor. But the process was credible, and credible process is the foundation on which everything else rests. The bilateral human-Varathari relationship developed in ways that were slower and more complicated than the optimistic projections from the immediate post-Meridian period, and more substantive than the skeptical ones. The Cultural Preservation Commission for the Outer Reach became, over several years, something neither party had originally anticipated. A genuine collaborative research project that attracted scholars from both civilizations and eventually from several others. The Varathari's historical record of the Reach was far more extensive than human researchers had understood. Human presence had left traces the Varathari found archaeologically interesting. The project produced joint publications and, more importantly, the kind of sustained intellectual contact that builds durable relationships between civilizations better than any treaty. Trade between Earth and Varathari-connected systems increased substantially over the decade following Meridian. This was not surprising. Normalized relations produce economic normalization, but the specific form it took was notable. Rather than the extractive, asymmetric resource exchange that characterized many Concord trade relationships, the human Varathari trade framework was structured around complementary specializations, with both parties identifying areas of genuine comparative advantage. The Varathari were extraordinarily skilled at certain categories of long-duration deep space fabrication that human industry had never prioritized. Humans had developed medical biotechnology that the Varathari had specifically not pursued, for reasons rooted in their philosophical traditions around biological intervention. Neither of these complementarities had been visible when the two civilizations were in an adversarial posture. They became visible when the adversarial posture ended. Dr. Miriam Okafor gave a lecture at the University of New Nairobi 11 years after Meridian, as part of the Centennial Symposium on Interspecies Diplomatic History. She was not the keynote speaker. She was on a panel about cultural intelligence in first contact and near-conflict scenarios, and she spoke for 32 minutes in the middle of an afternoon session that was moderately well attended. Her argument was not complicated. "We nearly went to war with the Varathari," she said, "because we built 47 colonial stations on their sacred ground without knowing it was sacred. We didn't know it was sacred because we hadn't read the literature. Not because the literature didn't exist. My paper from 2281 was available in any standard academic database, but because the people making colonial expansion decisions were not in the habit of consulting xenocultural research before making them." She let that sit. "The lesson I want to offer is not that diplomats should read more academic papers, though I have a personal stake in that recommendation. The lesson is that the cost of not knowing something is not distributed evenly. When a powerful civilization doesn't know something about a less powerful one, the less powerful civilization bears the cost. They always do. The Varathari bore the cost of our ignorance for 30 years. We almost asked them to bear the cost of a war on top of it. Meridian worked," she continued, "because a series of specific people made a series of specific good decisions. But the reason those decisions were available to be made, the reason Chin could ask the right question and Vraz could answer it, was that someone had done the work of understanding before the crisis forced the issue. The work of understanding doesn't announce itself as urgent. It rarely produces immediate policy impact. It sits in databases and academic journals and institutional memories, waiting for the moment when someone needs it." She paused before her conclusion. "The second long piece, if we build it well, will be built on that work. Not on fleets and deterrence, those matter, they always will, but on the discipline of learning things about our neighbors before we need to." The Interstellar Concord held its triennial full assembly 7 years after the Meridian Resolution. It was, by most external measures, a routine proceeding, the standard review of trade agreements, resource access frameworks, and administrative reports that constituted the bulk of interstellar governance. The kind of meeting that received minimal public attention and significant technical coverage in specialized diplomatic journals. But something was different about the assembly, and it was noticed by observers from multiple civilizations. 39 of the 41 Concord members were present in person, with credentialed delegations. The previous assembly had had 26 in-person delegations, the rest had participated by relay. The improvement was attributed to several factors, including logistical improvements at the assembly venue. But the deeper factor, noted by the Kelhari Compact's senior observer in her report to the Kelhari government, was more significant. Confidence in the process had recovered sufficiently that civilizations now considered in-person participation worth the investment. When an institution is perceived as dysfunctional, its members reduce their engagement. When it is perceived as functional, they increase it. The attendance figures are not a cause of institutional health, they are a symptom of it. The Assembly voted to make PRAT, the Provisional Rapid Arbitration Track, a permanent structural element of the Concord, with enhanced funding and mandatory staffing minimums. The vote was unanimous. It was also not a dramatic vote. It was a routine procedural item on the third day of a 5-day assembly. It passed without extended debate. That, perhaps, was the most significant thing about it. Director Emeka Osei retired from the United Earth Defense Secretariat 8 years after the Meridian Resolution. His farewell address was attended by representatives from 17 Concord member civilizations, which was unusual, and was notable for being unusually short. He spoke for 7 minutes. Most of it was personal and specific. Names of colleagues, moments he was grateful for, the kind of human particularity that formal occasions usually edit out. He ended with something that was widely quoted afterward, though he had not intended it as a quotable statement. He had simply thought it was true. The first piece lasted 3,000 years because 41 civilizations decided over and over again that the alternative was worse. That's not idealism. That's arithmetic. The second piece, the one we're building now, the one that starts from something more honest than the first, will last only as long as we keep doing the arithmetic. There is no permanent peace. There are only civilizations that keep choosing it. He paused. We chose it. That's worth something. Not everything, but something. In the outer reach, in the space where Kovac Station had once stood, there was now a marker. It was not large. It was not particularly visible to passing spacecraft. It had been placed there by the Viathari Cultural Preservation Commission, in consultation with the former residents of Kovac Station, several of whom had been asked to contribute text for it. The marker was written in both standard diplomatic Viathari and human English. In Viathari it said something that translated as, "Here is where those who did not know learned." The learning is part of the song. In English, at Hannah Kowalczyk's suggestion, it said something simpler. Kovac Station. 23 years. We were here. 3,217 years of peace had ended on a Tuesday in March, with a signal through a standard diplomatic relay. What came after was not perfect. It was not simple. It was not a story about humanity's superiority or the inevitability of good outcomes in a universe that offers no such guarantee. It was a story about a species that, when given a door instead of a wall, chose to walk through it, and then spent years making sure the door stayed open for everyone else. That, in the long accounting of interstellar history, was enough.